The best way to think about it, the employment relationship is a bundle of multiple decisions. And the control over those decisions can be decided by the worker or can be decided by the company. So those decisions could be like, what is the price we're going to charge customers? How are we going to deliver the service to the customer? Well, if I'm an employee at a company, if I'm employed, the company gets to decide. That's the whole point of a company. They just basically decide how to serve the customers, and then the workers or the employees, they obey. Well, in the case of Uber, some of those decisions are made by the drivers, but then the price is controlled by Uber. And Uber is just an example. There are others. And by the way, I think there's going to be many more. As companies realize I can just play around with these degrees of freedom. Maybe it's more efficient for some decisions to be taken by the workers, but for other decisions, it's more important to be done by the company.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Okay, so as we've said often on this show, work is a product and employees are customers of that product. That means that every company is multi-sided, which is to say that every company is a multi-sided business, one that must serve not just the traditional customer, but workers as well. Today, we go deep on the implications of this business model. My guest today is Andrei Hagiu, a professor at Boston University's Questrom School of Business and one of the world's absolute leading experts on platform strategy. Andrei has spent his career studying multi-sided platforms like Uber, Airbnb, and Amazon and the complex decisions that they face about pricing, control, and governance. In this episode, we explore how these dynamics apply to work itself. When is it efficient to give employees more control? What does platform governance even mean inside a company? And how do the legal definitions of employment constrain how we design work today? We also get into some surprising territory, like why Upwork and Airbnb are just variations on the same model, why consulting firms behave like platforms without calling themselves that, and what a cockfight in Mexico can teach us about platform pricing. All right, if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Andrei Hagiu. Andrei Hagiu, welcome to Work for Humans. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You don't really know, but I've been kind of stalking you for a while, intellectually.
I'm happy not to know.
Which is to say that you're one of the leading thinkers about multi-sided platforms, and you speak so eloquently about the kinds of strategic challenges that companies face when they want to be multi-sided platforms or go into a platform play. And so here on the show, we start from a framing, which is that work is a product, that employees are customers, and that this makes companies multi-sided businesses, not necessarily multi-sided platforms, which we'll talk about the difference. And I've only had one other top thinker in this topic, maybe a couple, and I wanted to get into the strategic considerations that multi-sided businesses face. And so, before we get into all of that, as far as I can tell, your research started with multi-sided platforms. When I go back to the beginning of your work, that's always been the case. What was it that led you into the field?
That's a good point. So I never wavered from my commitment to multi-sided platforms in my career. I started it during my PhD years, and this was early 2000s. And I guess this is when the first papers, like in economics, first one or two papers in economics on multi-sided platforms, multi-sided markets, as it was called at the time, appeared. And I thought it was very interesting. Once you start thinking about multi-sided platforms, there are lots of, let's call it traditional questions that have to be re-examined, like pricing. And there's also novel questions like, what is platform governance? I mean, if I have a firm that have full control of my product, I would never worry about platform governance. And it also, I think it's a combination of, there's some economics papers and also the explosion of internet-based businesses, which of course is where most multi-sided platforms have flourished. There's just this increasing realization that, so at the time, I think everybody cited the same 4 or 5 examples of multi-sided platforms. It was shopping malls, Alibaba, eBay, Sony PlayStation. Basically, there's very few. But of course, now there's a million multi-sided platforms online. So it became clear to me that it's going to be more and more relevant and, of course, more and more interesting. So that's why I stayed.
So we should define up front, what's the difference between a multi-sided platform and a multi-sided business?
I think that's a distinction that you are making, which I'm very curious to know how you're thinking. I can tell you the way I think about it is the following. So I think in my work, I think of multi-sided businesses. And I basically say a multi-sided business is essentially a business which serves multiple customer groups that have to interact with one another. That basically enables interactions between multiple customer groups. So it could be eBay. I'm enabling an interaction between buyers and sellers, and obviously any other marketplace, Amazon, Alibaba, Airbnb, and so on. By the way, it could also be one-sided. So it could be communication businesses like WhatsApp, Discord, what are we on? Riverside, things like that. And of course, credit cards and so on. I think of them as businesses. I basically equate the two. So if I speak very fast, I would say platforms, but what I have in mind is businesses. One thing I would mention, maybe that's where you're getting at. I think it's useful to focus on the business and not the company, because of course the same company could have multiple platforms, or they could have, I don't know, Amazon has Amazon.com, which is a platform, but they also have Amazon Web Services, which is a different platform. It's also a product, and they have many products as well. So I think it's just, this is the business. And in some cases, the business is eponymous with the company, and sometimes it's not.
Okay, there's one thing that you said that is the distinction that I want to make clear, which is that a one-sided platform is one that brings people with exactly the same needs together. And so you mentioned Zoom, for instance, or it's the people who want to talk to each other, they're the same. Multi-sided is you have people with different needs that are going to be brought together to provide value to each other.
Agreed. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but one of my observations is we're making it sound like there's a stark difference. It's like, well, two sides means two different groups, they have very different needs. One side, one group, they have the same needs. And it's true in general. Like you can say, well, eBay is clearly two-sided versus Discord or something like that is one-sided. But if you think about it a bit more carefully, you realize there's a spectrum. Any definition you want, like with multiple platforms, platform businesses, there's always going to be a spectrum. So for instance, you can think about YouTube, right? Forget advertisers for a second, but think about content creators and viewers. Well, is it clear the distinction between the two? I don't know. Some viewers are also creators and vice versa. There are people who are mostly creators and there are people who are just doing viewing. But you can see how it's a bit of a continuum. That's why to me, the thing that matters, in some cases, it's true, like the differences are very fundamental. But I think to me, the thing that matters is basically the platform enables a direct interaction. And that interaction can be many different things.
So I want to talk about the direct interaction point, which is that when it comes to the topic of work and employment, there are multi-sided, I would argue, that there are multi-sided structures that really disintermediate. And so an example would be TaskRabbit, where we're bringing people who do work to people who need the work done. But then a level down from that might be management consultants, which is what's happening there. You're bringing together people who are going to do the work with people who need the work done. But then you go a level farther, and now you've got people who are going to do some work to create a product, whatever, and then that product is going to be resold to somebody. So what's happening is, as we go down this thing, we're getting less and less disintermediated. I don't know if that's a word we still use, but less and less disintermediated, more distance between the two, but still providing value to each other, even though there's more distance.
There's a couple of interesting things in there, but I just want to make sure I understand. When I hear disintermediation, I think about something very different.
Let me say it a different way instead of disintermediated. A lot of your work has spoken about how platforms bring two different customer types together, and that the company is not an intermediate, is enabling it, but is not controlling necessarily the interaction between the two. But the amount of distance between one side and the other increases if you're building cars, for instance. So now you have a workforce that's building cars. The cars are now something that's being sold, but you still have these two sides, people who want to consume work and people who want to buy cars.
I love that distinction. It's very interesting. I've thought about this for many years. I always thought it's interesting, but it's like I never got around to do a research project. But I love the fact that you're interested in that. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is, I think of this as a continuum. So part of this distance, the way you say it, between the people who provide the work and the customers, it could be inherent in the nature of the product or service. So of course, for services, there's 0 degree of separation between the worker and the customer, almost by definition. Maybe with AI, it's going to be different now. But with products, an employee of Toyota does not talk to the customer of Toyota. Versus consulting, the employee of McKinsey talks all the time to the customer of McKinsey. So that's going to be true for a lot of services. And I think what's interesting there, so it gets into, I still think, so this is basically the distance, quote unquote. The distance is a bit like determined by the nature of the product or the service. But I think what I would propose to you is that sometimes that's a matter of strategy. Some firms can design the work relationship to increase or decrease that distance. So you can think about, if you're McKinsey, the interesting thing is you have the traditional consulting firms where basically the consultants are the employees of the firm. Now, the consultants are doing the work for the client. So they basically see the client. So it's not a platform because basically McKinsey controls everything. But what does that mean? Well, it's basically you have McKinsey templates and the contract of the client is with McKinsey and blah, 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 right? But you can see a very different versions of this going forward. And there are companies that are trying to disrupt consulting by basically doing platforms for consulting, like marketplace for consulting services. You can think of the consultants more like freelancers and they provide their services. And by the way, that happens with traditional consulting companies. Sometimes a very good, very popular and very good partner at McKinsey, they might be so good, they might say, why am I working for McKinsey? I can just take the clients and just do the work. What exactly is McKinsey bringing to the table in this relationship? And that's possible. That definitely happens, right? Part of it is the nature, of course, with services, it's closer, but it's also the firm can decide, do I want to run this closer to a platform or do I want to have more control?
What I want to talk about is the strategic decisions that platforms need to think about. And I'm drawing a lot from one of your papers, which is the Strategic Decisions for Multi-Sided Platforms, well named. And I want to talk about what some of those are. And it may be that they're all applicable and important to the topic of work. And they may not be, and that's fine, and we'll learn something. So what are the big strategic decisions that firms face?
If you could call me on that one, I think that article is quite long ago. And one of the things that I always pride myself is that my work advances pretty fast. So basically an article that I've written a while ago, I don't remember everything. And I hope that actually my views have somewhat changed. Now, there are certain things that are constant. So I apologize in advance, but I think I remember vaguely what those are. I think I may have slightly different view today. So this is a bit do you want to be a one-sided or a two-sided or a three-sided platform? When is that applicable? I guess it's let's say, just pick a communication app, pick Discord. Discord's a good one. So you start as a pure communication one side. That's how they started. Communication between video game players. Well, today there's more than one side. They basically have people that's third-party developers. So they have some sort of third-party apps. I forget there's a name for it. I think it's called bots. It's the people who want to use it, but they can create a bit like bots, which are like mini apps on Discord. So you can have your communities. So the point is you can increase the number of sides. I think naturally, the very successful platforms, they start one side, and sometimes maybe it's not even one side. It's like a product, and then you add 2 sides, 3 sides, and so on. Of course, it gets more and more complex, but it's a good idea to start with fewer sides, and then maybe just increasingly add sides as opposed to 5-sided platform from day one. Fairly obvious.
You described in that article a couple of companies that started off 2-sided, and then they decided to go 3 or 4, and they just found that the overhead to doing that was not worth the return, and they backed off. On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull, so you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com.
Design is basically, well, I guess, what do you do to make those interactions that you're enabling better? The way I would think about it today is quite different probably from the article. I would think about, are you allowing the multiple sides to find each other more easily so you reduce search costs? Or do you also make it possible for them to conduct transactions and make it easier to say? So you can have, like, for example, marketplaces where it's mostly search, say, I don't know, Craigslist, but then transactions are off the platform. Or you can go all the way, do like Airbnb, where there's search and there's escrow and you can pay and everything gets on the platform, right? Typically, it's like anything you can do to make the transactions easier and smoother between the multiple sides, I think that's great. Governance is probably going to be most relevant here. So governance, the way I think about it is like, what rules do you put in place for how the different sides can interact? I'd probably talk about some funny examples like the I Am Rich app and stuff like that. I would call this interesting platform governance puzzles. Should I allow this app? Should I not allow this app? But I think for our purposes, maybe a better framing for governance would be in terms of how much control does the platform wants to exert over interactions? Maybe that's what it comes down to at a high level. Do I want very specific rules where I get to dictate a lot, or do I want to allow like a lot of freedom?
What's an example of a really free platform and what's an example of a more controlled platform?
So the way I present this to students, you'll appreciate this. When I talk about governance with students, I say, well, think about the continuum between North Korea and authoritarianism and like pure democracy, right? What's the closest to like a pure democracy? I would say probably like something like Craigslist. There's zero governance. So how do we know that? Because there's crime on Craigslist. So we know they don't do any governance whatsoever. It's funny enough, nobody sues them. I know if I go on Craigslist, you have to be really careful. Versus the other platforms, they do governance and you expect some level of curation and policing and say, oh, something happened, I'm going to complain to the platform. In the case of Craigslist, it's like something happens, like my fault. Basically, it's completely free for all. So I would say Craigslist is very extreme. Most marketplaces, like even the freest ones, I don't know, eBay or like, there's definitely policies and restrictions. You can't sell, I don't know, plutonium on eBay, right? I mean, there's definitely some rules. So it's not fewer. So, but those I think are the freest. And then the more authoritarian platforms, I would probably say like Apple with the App Store, because I mean, that's why Epic and others sued Apple, right? It's like very controlling. They want to impose their own things. Apple's pretty authoritarian. Uber's interesting because they control price, right? So it's free in the sense like you can choose whatever car you want, choose your schedule. Like if you're a driver, but one thing you don't get to choose is your price. They control the price.
Let's talk about Uber for a second. One of your articles was about the ideal marketplace regulation for employment versus contracts for companies like Uber. And this was a while ago. And at that time, California had passed a law that said that Uber drivers were employees. Since then, that's been reversed, and Uber drivers are now considered contractors. But what you put forth is that there should be something in between these two. Can you describe the reason for that? And I'll say that one of the things you said is that it's inefficient to have a strict dichotomy between contractor and employee. Why was that?
The laws that we had, employment versus independent contracting, were written a long time ago, before platforms, probably before the internet. I think the more you study platforms, the more you realize the distinction between platform and non-platform is not a bright line or binary distinction. There's clearly continuum, especially here. So let's think about platforms for services versus essentially employers. At one extreme, you have a pure platform, say like Upwork, the workers, the people that perform the work. Upwork has minimal intervention, right? They set their prices, they decide what to work on, everything, right? And they're hired by clients and they get reviews like in the marketplace. And then you can contrast this, the other extreme, I don't know, pick something. So what will be the employment equivalent of that will be something like Infosys, like the traditional outsourcing company, where you basically hire the company and then they hire the workers. And then the workers work for the company and basically the company pays them. There's no direct interaction with the customer, right? Well, if you think about that, the dichotomy is clear there. But of course, Uber is actually in the middle. So that's why it's a good example. It's somewhere in the middle. So you can say, well, what kind of degrees of freedom do the drivers have? Well, the degrees of freedom they have seem a little bit more compatible with independent contracting because they can choose whatever car they want to drive. They can choose when to drive and where, which rides to accept. Uber doesn't get to tell them you have to be on the road from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. They just choose their schedules. But, for example, Uber does control something very important. They control price. So they set the price just like a normal employer would do. So that's not compatible with the platform, right? The best way to think about it, well, so the employment relationship, think about it as a bundle of multiple decisions. And the control over those decisions can be exerted by the worker, can be decided by the worker, or can be decided by the company. So those decisions could be like, what is the price we're going to charge customers? What is the equipment, in this case, the car that we're going to use to deliver the service to the customer? How are we going to deliver the service to the customer? Where and for how long? So you can think about there's many of those decisions. Well, if I'm an employee at a company, if I'm employed, the company gets to decide. That's the whole point of a company. They just basically decide how to serve the customers, and then the workers or the employees, they obey. Well, in the case of Uber, some of those decisions are made by the drivers, but then the price is controlled by Uber. And by the way, so is the matching algorithm. On a pure marketplace, like say Upwork or Airbnb, Airbnb is basically, you have search, but I can choose. The traveler gets to look at different hosts and say, I'm going to pick this person. And then if they accept, then they get it. Like Airbnb doesn't say you have to pick this person. In the case of Uber, it's very different. It's not like the driver sits there and browses through driver profiles. The algorithm assigned it. So the only decision you have as a driver is like yes or no. And there's very strong incentives to say yes, because otherwise you get downgraded in the queue. So there's some decisions that are made by the drivers. There are some decisions made by Uber. And this is basically places them squarely in the middle. Like if you try and think the world is a dichotomy, employment versus pure platform, well, I'm sorry, Uber is just in the middle. And just becomes obvious when you start to look at Uber, it's hard to say it's pure employment or pure independent contracting. That's why I think it makes sense. And Uber is just an example. There are others. And by the way, I think there's going to be many more. As companies realize I can just play around with these degrees of freedom, maybe it's more efficient for some decisions to be taken by the workers, but for other decisions, it's more important to be done by the company.
And central to that point, though, is this idea of efficiency. And I'm wondering how you're defining this idea of efficiency.
The question then is, okay, so if I have a choice, I think of it as a strategic decision, right? So there are the decisions to be made, so pricing, car, and so on. But then there's also the allocation of control. The higher level strategy is, how do I organize my company? Do I want to be closer to a platform or closer to employment? Then the question is like, how do I decide whether a specific decision should be made by the workers versus by me, the company? So I would say, well, the rational thing to do is to say, well, who's in a better position to make that decision? And that could depend on many factors. Let's say take pricing. So pricing is a good one. I discussed this with my students when we talk about this in class. I say, well, why does Uber control price? Why not allow the drivers to like, by the way, you can imagine, and you don't have to imagine. This has been done. There's a company called Sidecar, which went out of business in 2015 or something, which is basically Uber, except drivers set their prices. So I think it takes very little reflection to realize why that's problematic, right? If you have drivers setting prices, do they know what are the market clearing prices? What is the impression you have as a rider if you come to a marketplace like this and basically like the driver prices are all over the place? So it's very clear that in a case like this, being driven around as a commodity service, a ride is a ride. It makes a lot more sense for Uber to centralize decision-making over price. It should be pretty obvious. And I ask students, okay, so just to nail this. So in the case of Uber, it makes sense. And then I say, well, how about on Airbnb? Wouldn't you apply the same argument? And I would say, no. I mean, it's interesting. If the idea is who has more information about demand should make a decision over price, well, in the case of Uber, it's very clear. It's Uber. Well, Airbnb also, I would argue, actually has more information about demand than an individual host. So you might say, well, Airbnb should centralize pricing, but then you quickly realize the problem with that. It's like, yeah, but what they don't know is like they don't know the full details of the host. I mean, they know a little bit about the house, so they know what the demand part is, but I don't know the opportunity cost of the host. I mean, I have some information, but I don't know. Some hosts are like, listen, I will only rent this house for like certain reserve price. I don't care what the market sustains. I'll not rent it. So they may have very different reasons. It's their house, right? So they can, so whatever. So in some sense, it's like you can see Airbnb is kind of trying to do both. They're suggesting prices to hosts. Of course they would, because they have more information about demand. But of course, ultimately they leave it at the discretion of the host.
Well, a good reason for that, which makes a lot of sense. There is cost to renting, which I experience, which is Airbnb does not experience the risk of a rental. And Airbnb does not experience the cost to me of not visiting my house.
Exactly. And they have no idea what that is, right? So you can say, oh, but what about Uber? What's the difference? It's just a car, right? I mean, it's more standardized. But here it's very important. It's your house. It's a lot more important.
Can you describe something that's sort of in the middle? You mentioned in one of your articles that other countries have something that stands between full-time regular and contract.
So you mean from a legal standpoint?
I do. Well, it's all merged together for me, which is that there are legal constraints that, in fact, this is something I discovered in researching this show, this episode. It's really weird, is that who decides what the categories of worker are going to be in the United States? It's the IRS. And why do they make that decision? They make it to make it possible to tax appropriately. And so they need to create the brightest lines they can so that they can tax appropriately, but that's not necessarily the motivation that's going to create the most efficient outcome for businesses.
I totally agree. I think for listeners, I think it's useful to sort of be clear about this, right? So there's the legal distinction between employee and contractor. And again, hopefully from our discussion up to now, it's clear that just trying to draw a bright line sometimes just doesn't make sense. I think we understand there's a continuum. And the reality of these businesses is that they operate on a continuum. And if the regulators are trying to force a binary distinction, honestly, it's a bit silly. So the first thing I would say is you can have like a continuum of categories, but let's say you need at least one in the middle, something like that, because you want it to mirror. And then you can ask, well, what's the inefficiency created by, say, drawing a bright line? Well, the inefficiency is, so first of all, I think that's what we described in the article. It leads to a lot of misaligned incentives, if you will. So if you tell Uber your drivers are employees, well, now they're actually going to exert more control over the drivers because they're employees. So they're going to tell them what to do. So it's like it actually removes what's appealing about Uber for drivers, which is they have the freedom to work whenever they want. Now you're making it extremely costly for Uber to operate because employment means a whole host of costly responsibilities.
It's not just the cost. It's that the kind of control that they would exert is these are the hours you're going to work. You're not going to drive for Lyft on one of our competitors. That's a part of what comes with that control. And some employees want the freedom to work their own hours.
Exactly. That's exactly why these are attractive in the first place, right? So you can see how that's silly. Now, again, if you say like they're purely independent contractors, I mean, I think that's closer to the truth in this case, but Uber does control certain aspects. So maybe Uber should have some responsibility, legal responsibility. I don't think it's conceptually very hard to imagine. Say, okay, what does an employer have to do? I don't know, they have to pay healthcare and things like that. Well, I had a VC friend who was proposing this. I don't see why that's complicated other than politics. But why can't you have like a sliding scale of benefits, generally speaking, of employee benefits that depend on how many hours you work on my platform? So you pay in proportion to that. What's wrong with that, right? I mean, you can think about it just broadly. So if I'm a firm, I get to decide how much control I'm going to exert of the employees. More control comes with more responsibility and more cost. I mean, that's basically the logic. It should be that way legally, and that aligns it with the business reality.
One of the things that happens in this dichotomy between the two is that a lot more protections kick in, labor protections kick in as you become a full-time regular employee. So this is something that doesn't come up very much in the literature about employment. It is this framing that we use, which is that work is a product that companies sell. And so that framing is kind of a shorthand to say that there's a package of value that you get when you subscribe to an employer or as a contractor or as an employee. And so I started looking into the list of products and services that are governed by laws to protect people from harm from the product. Food safety, food labeling and nutrition, dietary supplements, alcohol, prescription drugs, over-the-counter drug safety. There's 30 of these, actually, different products that are regulated so that they don't cause harm to consumers. Then I looked into, okay, so what are the similarities between product protections and employment protections? And the answer was they're regulated for very much the same reason. And it seems to me like this scale from contractor to employee is munging together a lot of things that change along that scale. And one of them is the degree to which the people doing the work need to be protected from harm from the product. That's one of the lines of reasoning that I'm not very deep on right now, but it's something that it seems to me like this 2x2 that has to do with control is munging things together that maybe should be teased apart.
I think we can make it a little bit more clear and more generalizable. I don't think it's just protections for workers, it's protection for the customers as well. So think about basically, there's a product or service being provided, there's a worker, the firm in the middle, and there's the customer. If we're in a traditional employment relationship, the firm, which is in the middle, the firm is fully responsible for the provision and for anything that goes wrong with the product, right? Everything you mentioned, like food, like the restaurant, food safety, blah, blah, right? It's like anything that goes wrong with the product, from the customer's perspective, the firm is fully responsible. Now imagine we take that relationship and now I make it into a platform. So now basically I'm just intermediating, the firm is just intermediating between the worker and the customer. And by the way, actually in the first one, in the traditional employment view, so the firm is responsible for everything that goes on from the customer side. And they're also responsible, which is I think what you had in mind, worker protection, right? So like the worker works with a company, there's some laws about this, right? Protecting workers from abuse by companies. So essentially the firm is responsible to both sides. They have full control, which comes with full responsibility. And I can take the other extreme, which is now I operate like, say, a marketplace, pure platform between the two sides. Well, now the responsibility is with the two parties. Well, not all of it. And I think this is one of a very interesting topic is how much responsibility does the platform maintain? So I'm not an employer. I don't have 100% responsibility, but I probably don't have zero either. And there's good reasons, both legal, but also reputational for that. So say now it's basically, I don't know, it's Upwork. And then the worker serves a client via Upwork. And let's say something goes wrong. Well, first of all, Upwork doesn't really have much obligation with respect to the workers. Like it says, they don't have to pay benefits. Now, from the customer side, something goes wrong with the project. Well, who's responsible? Is it Upwork or is it the worker? And the answer is probably both. And this has been like, there's lots of examples of this. Upwork could try to say, oh, we're just a platform. We didn't have anything to do with the work, but it's not going to fly, right? I mean, you can see how that creates a reputational problem for customers, right? If something goes wrong with the client, yeah, sure, I came to your platform and I basically got a worker. But if I have a bad experience, I may just not come back to Upwork. If you're just insisting, like, I have no responsibility. So the reality is you do have to have some responsibility. I don't think it's a legal requirement. It's just part of it is a sound business practice.
One of the things you pointed out in one of your papers is that the bright line between contractor and employee, one of the problems is that if I'm Upwork, I have a hard time providing benefits to people who are providing services through Upwork because that crosses the line into an employment practice and my workers get recategorized.
Right. So there's the strategy issue, there's the legal. So this is back to like, why is it inefficient to have these old dichotomies, employment versus independent contracting? And that's one of the inefficiencies. Is basically, if I see that line, I think it's basically what you mentioned earlier. Because the line is defined by these very different, maybe irrelevant considerations by the IRS, well, something like if you provide education to the workers, you're more likely to be categorized as an employer. So basically, what it does suggest, if I'm a platform, I have zero incentive to educate, like to provide education to my workers, even though it would be beneficial for both, because they might be categorized from a legal standpoint as employees. I mean, I think that's completely silly. That's a flaw in the legal system. I was thinking of something more broad here. So there's basically the legal issue, which is keep in mind what the law is and figure out where you want to be in the eyes of the law. But there's also the strategy issue, right? So, okay, I'm a platform. Within the boundaries of being a platform, how much responsibility do I want to take? Right? This is not necessarily legal responsibility, although it could be in the contract, right? But how much responsibility do I want to assume for the work being provided? All platforms have struggled. I think it's a very interesting question. So, for instance, there was a case early on in Airbnb's life. Inevitably, someone like a guest burned down the house. They had a party, and the party didn't go very well. At the time, Airbnb didn't have any insurance. They said, well, we can provide moral support and a phone number, but basically, it's like, what do you mean? So after that, of course, the reasonable thing for Airbnb to do is to provide a pretty generous insurance policy. Now, I don't know if they do it or a third-party insurance company, but there's no question. I think if you're a host, your house, when it's listed, gets insured by Airbnb for up to something like $1 million or something like that. Of course, if you're beyond that, you can probably do it. But you can see how it becomes a strategic decision. I want to assume responsibility for certain things because even though I'm a platform, I may be held responsible.
So there's two areas I want to go into. Well, the first area that I want to go into, you explicitly said this is something you probably can't answer in our communications, but I still want to just test to see if you've seen what people do about this, which is in a multi-sided business like, let's say, the New York Times. They've got readers and advertisers. Well, those are two very different customers. And so what they do is they set up an organizational structure that gives autonomy to the editorial team and autonomy to the advertising team so that they can serve their customer to the best of their ability.
I don't know what the answer is, but it's interesting. Are those two really autonomous from each other?
Well, it's like one of these things. Are they autonomous? They're completely dependent upon each other.
From the business standpoint. And
from the business standpoint.
If I'm maximizing profits for the New York Times, I'm just I need to maximize profits, there's very little chance that the optimal answer is full independence of the two sides. You can see how, from a business standpoint, it might be optimal to actually for them to talk to one another and coordinate. So it's like, hey, our advertisers will not advertise if you put, of course, that's why I think it's interesting. It's like maybe it's credibility issues, but you can see how maybe I do want them to talk to one another, which is an interesting question.
And in fact, I think that the experience of that for people in that role is that it's a constant fight and that there's an antagonistic relationship between the two. And the job of the top leadership is to essentially manage it.
But it's their role to basically decide, what do we want to do? Do we want to maintain the reputation of being unbiased, or do we want to maximize advertising revenue?
Right. And so it's not complete autonomy, except there's an orientation to both sides, which is that the orientation of the editorial staff is we're going to write stuff people want to read, right? We've got a customer and they want a quality product, which is actually not completely true, right? Because they're like, we're not going to pander. We're not going to pander. But that's because they're creating a product that people want to buy, a product that doesn't pander. So there's that side. And then the other side is like, look, we just want the most eyes. And it's not just, one of the things you have said quite a few times is that the great thing about a platform is that they get better the more there are on both sides, the more customers are on both sides, but also that the quality of customer, which is the New York Times wants to win people who want to buy. I just published in the Harvard Business Review. You know what they advertised? $7,000 watches using my article. That's what they advertised. And that's because they're winning the kind of customer that they want to advertise to. Anyway, where was I going with that? Just the question of what you have seen in terms of managing the relationship between the parts of the company that serve completely different customers.
There is a company I spent a lot of time with, which is Intuit. I spent like a year and a half, and then I've been in touch with them ever since. I follow what they do. I had pretty good exposure, but I think it's quite different in their case. The topic there was how do we transform our products into platforms? That was very interesting to me. I guess there's some interesting internal organization issues that I've observed, but that's a different question from the one you're asking. So the one you're asking, and I think it's basically specific to context in which sometimes the interests of the multiple sides may be divergent, right? If the interests of the multiple sides are aligned, then I don't think there's any problem. And in many cases there are. But for example, anything that's users and advertisers, there's definitely going to be conflict. Why? Because users don't care about advertisers. In fact, they don't want advertisers. So There's definitely certain things. If I'm basically trying to listen to the people that want to maximize the experience for users, you will do certain things, such as not putting ads in the middle of an article like it's online, not doing split screens to maximize the advertising space. But if you're the person in the company that talks to advertisers, you would want to say, basically, you want the people that put up content. You want to say, hey, can you please make the content longer so we can insert more ads? Can you make it fit onto multiple pages so we can put more display ads, right? And yeah, the person at the top has to decide, how do we make a compromise between the interests of advertisers and users? To be honest, I don't have firsthand experience of this. That's my point. I don't know, but I can imagine. I mean, it's not hard to imagine. It's like somebody has to decide that. I know that in the company, companies tend to have very specialized roles. So there's probably a person who's like, you need to go get us advertisers. Get advertisers, get them to spend money on it. Okay. And then the advertiser is going to ask questions. Okay, well, where exactly are ads going to show? And what are you going to do to make those ads very visible to the readers, right? And then that person has to go talk to the content team probably, and say, hey, where are you going to put the ads? And say, you can't put the ads at the bottom only because nobody's going to read them. Yeah, but I don't want to do that because I'm compromising the user experience. And I'm sure there's some negotiation. I can easily imagine that.
I like that. I like the idea that this tug of war appears right there on the page.
Yeah, it's basically the page is a reflection of the compromise.
Of who's winning the tug of war, exactly. You've said in one of your papers that sometimes one side of the business is either subsidized or acquired for free. I'm wondering how far that goes. How far does subsidization go? And does it go into acquiring one side at a loss?
Yeah, definitely. So examples would be, I don't know, first one that comes to my mind is video game consoles. At least when they're launched, they're sold at below cost, below their cost of manufacturing. Why? Because they want to be, it's penetration pricing and it's the razor blades logic. I get more consoles than I make money on the games that are being sold for their consoles. So it's rational to lose money on the consoles because then you hope if you're the platform, you're going to make it by selling first-party games and by extracting royalties from third-party games that are being sold on those consoles. So that's a good example.
What's interesting is that if you look at the New York Times, for instance, the history of the New York Times, it used to make most of its money off of ads. But as competition came into the market for ad space, they've actually really had to lean on their subscriptions.
Yeah. And there's some that went the opposite way, right? So like Netflix was pure subscription, but now they also have like a lot of content services online, they're converging to this middle. There's a free tier plus advertising, and then there's a premium tier where you don't pay ads. I think Netflix, they now have an advertising tier. So it's like you pay a lower price. It's not zero. I think there's a price, but it's lower, but you just have to be exposed to ads. But there are other examples, right? The classic example of subsidy is, I find it particularly funny. Some people find it problematic. It's the nightclub strategy. Basically, let women in for free, give them free drinks, and then you make men pay. You can ask why. I think everybody has their theory. Nightclubs around the world have converged on this strategy. So surely there must be something on it. I'll just give you a funny observation because I looked into this recently. Let's say this used to be very clearly advertised everywhere, right? Like ladies' nights, basically. It's like ladies come in free, blah, 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 and it's like men pay. I would encourage you and the listeners to try to find like ladies' nights. It's impossible. Nobody does this in the US anymore for obvious reasons, right? They don't want to be sued for like whatever, gender discrimination and stuff like that. However, you can find plenty of those. So I go to Singapore a lot. There's plenty of clubs in Singapore that advertise ladies' nights for free. I just find this like culturally interesting. It's like, I don't think they care about this kind of legislation. The strategy is still there. Like, there's no question that nightclubs in the US, they still continue doing this. It's just that they can't advertise it openly.
So in the case of employees, what they are paid, one of the arguments that I run into in these discussions is employees can't be customers, we pay them. And because we pay them, we have control over them, so they're not customers. And a part of the reason I ask about the degree of subsidy is, can there be negative pricing? Which is essentially, I'm going to pay you. You don't pay me to come work here. I'm going to pay you to come work here. It's negative pricing.
Yeah, so my first reaction to that's a really silly question. I know it's not you asking it, like it's usually silly. So to me, it's like this usually comes from people getting confused between accounting and actual like strategy. There's no fundamental difference between me paying you or like you paying me a negative price. You can see it's just pure accounting, right? It's like, it doesn't matter. So for instance, okay, pick a marketplace like Upwork. It's a matter of like, how do they settle? Like, do the workers pay Upwork to be there? So, well, yeah, because they perform work for the client. They get, let's say the worker performs $100 worth of work for a client, then Upwork takes their cut. So I can it's like, who pays whom? So, well, I can say, well, I don't know, they pay Upwork for the privilege of providing their services on the platform, 10%, right? But I can also say Upwork pays them because presumably Upwork is the one that bills the client and they take the money and then just pay them at the end of the month. So to me, it's like, we can call it however we want. It's just pure, like, it's silly accounting, right? I mean, I don't think it really matters. What matters is, what is the net? So on a platform, it is possible. So by the way, for example, if the platform does a transaction fee, it's not like you don't pay like a fixed admission fee, right? They just say, okay, you provide $100 worth of services. I'm going to take 10% of that. And I could take 10% from the buyer, 10% from the seller. So basically like surcharged. So let me put it this way. Seller sells 100 worth of services or product to the buyer. So there's buyer pays $100 to the seller. If I have a platform, there's multiple ways to do this, multiple ways to extract the fee, right? So I can say, I'm going to tax this at 10%. Now, I can take 10% out of the $100 that the seller receives. So the seller gets 90. I can tax $10 to the buyer. So paying 100, they pay 110, and I take the 10. Or I can split the two, right? So I can take $5 from the buyer. It's like, you can do it however you want. I mean, this is an interesting question. Like, there's some economics results that it would say, well, it's a bit like taxation. It doesn't really matter how you split it because the seller is going to adjust their price. Like, it's basically like, if you charge me 10%, I'll pass it through. I don't think pass-through is perfect. If pass-through of the price is not perfect, obviously maybe it matters, right? But to me, it's a bit more like the nature of the fees. I'm not very interested in the accounting, like who pays who. It's like, what is the fee? Is it a transaction fee or is it a fixed fee? So pay me for access, like pay to enter the nightclub and then you're free to roam around the building.
I experienced some of this firsthand, which is I worked for the cockfights in Mexico briefly. And the way it worked was there was a guy in the center of the arena and he had a one-sided market, which is he had people who wanted to bet on opposite sides. And so he had a tennis ball and somebody would say, look, I've got $1,000. I want to bet on this bird. And so he'd throw them the tennis ball and they'd put $1,000 in there. They'd throw him back the tennis ball and he'd take the $1,000, he'd put it in and says, okay, I've got to bet $1,000, but the odds are 2-1. And so I'm looking for $2,000. $2,000. Somebody said, I'll take that bet. He throws in the tennis ball, he takes it back.
And he puts the piles of cash on the opposite sides to remember who bet on what.
I have no idea how he remembered. I think he was a genius.
But we also don't want to have disputes afterwards, right? It's like,
or did he write it down? I don't know.
Maybe like there has to be a way to sort of, exactly, remember who bet on what.
So my job was to take 7.5 for the house. And so the house got 7.5 and they provided the cockfight auditorium and brought all the cockfighters together. The 7.5 goes to the house. The 2.5 goes to, or some other proportion goes to the people who had the roosters. And then another portion goes to the guy in the center of the ring.
And who does the 7.5% come from?
It comes from the winner.
Right. If you're a loser, well, you just lost, right? And if you're a winner, you
That's
just
right.
Right. No, that makes sense in that case. By the way, that is the greatest example that is. You should write. I mean, you need to write an article about this, Dart. This is like the most interesting platform I've ever heard of.
It's so pure and it's so visible.
And it also makes it very clear. It's a bit like we can do the accounting one of many different ways. It doesn't really matter. It's like what matters is the net.
But also because the winner doesn't experience the cut. The winner just won $900 and something. They don't notice it the same way. It's not like you've lost $1,000 and you owe us another, $250.
That's a really good point. So it's actually like you can write a very nice article about this, thinking about what it illustrates. So it's everybody is just a bettor. So it's one-sided. I agree.
One-sided.
Ex post, there's two sides. There's people who lose and people who won. But ex ante is everybody's the same, right? It's a bit like stock traders on an exchange. So in the case of actually traders, I think they pay a fee to be allowed on the exchange, to be allowed to trade, the big brokers. In this case, there's no fee, right? There's no fee to participate. And there's going to be just a transaction fee that is only charged on the winners. And of course, you can easily explain why that's optimal. But they could, at least in principle, they could have said, listen, you want to bet? I will systematically you want to bet $100, you have to give me $107.5, right? You could do that.
Exactly.
But I agree with you. It makes a lot more sense because the person who wins is happy. They're not going to argue with 7.5% if they double their money or something like that.
Yeah. And I don't know, there may have been entrance fees.
If you ever go back and do consulting for cockfight organizers, maybe you should say, like, have you really considered all possible options? Have you really optimized your pricing?
As the nights went on, it became very clear that I was working for organized crime. So I'll tell you, another really weird thing was that the security was the Mexican military.
I'm sure there's somewhere there was a cut for them as well.
Or a fee or something. And I'll bet that was off the books.
Exactly.
Use of the Mexican military.
I think we can learn everything we need to know about platform pricing. We can learn through that example.
That's very interesting. Okay, so I have a few more questions that I always ask at the end, which I think we have time to do. What job do you, Andrei, hire your job to do for you?
Oh, very good. This is a very good question. It basically makes you feel like you have agent, which we all should do in our private lives, in our professional lives, is basically have agency, like act as if you're like an independent agent. I think the main thing is audience for my research and possibly also like consulting and other endeavors. So I view it as, if you will, like a platform for sure. Platform to basically get recognition. How do I monetize that? Well, through consulting. And the other thing is it makes me, I also think of it as like, it's a forcing device to basically go very deep in this topic. For example, I angel invest a lot. And I think, well, we'll see if my decisions are good or not. But I like to think that because of my research, because of this job, I get to think, it forces me to think very deeply about this and makes me a better angel investor. So then you'd say, so what does it do for me? It provides me with training. I love your question, by the way. That's a really good question. Can I add something to this?
Yeah.
So there's one thing that, I have a VC friend who's interested in market. Right? Basically, all he does is marketplaces. He's described this to me for many years now, this vision of work. So today, like most people are still basically employed. They have an employer, right? And I think for that reason, most people do not think of the question that you just asked. I go to the office and I do whatever my employer, and I just wait for the check at the end of the month. And his vision, and I actually believe in this, it's just maybe it's taken longer than we expected, is that basically this idea that most people are going to be in a single home, work for one company. I think it's obsolete. If you have like a specific expertise, there's no reason you should work for one company. So you should be more like a free agent doing projects for multiple companies. So basically be on a platform. And then you start thinking, and then basically what that suggests, you should think the way you described it, which is, what am I doing not for this company, but what am I getting from this platform?
A lot of what people want is, when I've asked that question, is I want to take care of my family. And to some extent, that involves de-risking.
I know. That's why we like employment is safe. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
but it's not safe. Anyway.
100% agree. It's just better philosophically to act as if you have agency, right? It's like, I'm not a passive cog.
How could we design your job so that it did that for you better? So your employer is now designing this product for you that does that job for you. Could it be designed better to do that job better?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, I think of it as a platform, again, to match me, say, with students. I think the way they match me with students, it's inefficient in many ways. It's driven by a lot of considerations, which I consider irrelevant. It should be basically, listen, we have faculty like me who have a certain expertise that's really good. Let's just make it as easy as possible for students who are interested in that to take that class. None of this, you have to have certain quotas, you have to have these pre-required courses, and it's just make the matching with my audience better. So this is with students. Now, I would also appreciate, for example, if the employers were better, universities in general got better at exposing their faculty that have something interesting to say to outside audiences. Again, doing more, for example, content like this. This is a very interesting podcast. I love it. Why can't universities do more of it? They're terrible. I've seen some university podcasts, they're usually pretty stilted. It's not that interesting. It's they're not, again, it's not done. It should be done. There's some faculty that have their own podcasts, and those tend to be much better. But if a university has resources, that would be good. Just expose your faculty, their research to the outside world. to become basically a better platform.
I like that a lot. I've heard the first part, which is that often students are acquired in the first place. Now, this is a company that is a supply chain of students to you, and that's how you acquire that work. And some faculty have said, I wish I had students who had more intellectual curiosity as opposed to wanting to just go make money someplace. And so that's a filter that could be put on that optimize the supply chain for you.
And by the way, you could think about it as like if you want to be really forward-looking. So right now, so I don't know how realistic it is, but right now, okay, the student just basically, they pick the school just based on the brand name of the school. It's very, very rare that they pick the school, oh, there's this faculty that I've heard of that does this particular work that is going to be relevant to my career, so I want to go to that school. I would say we should go in that direction. So that's more the platform where you're making the worker side more visible to the customer side. Why? Because, well, okay, if you believe that education is the best thing, well, your education is your faculty. And if you happen to have like faculty that have like really, say, popular courses, like really good courses, shouldn't that be the main attractor as opposed to the traditional, like, come here because of of course the brand is correlated with that, but surely there's ways to make it a bit more visible, right? To make the actual employees / faculty more visible.
That makes a lot of sense.
And you could apply this, actually, it's interesting. You could apply this, can think about like even traditional companies. Of course, it makes sense for McKinsey, right? To say like, hire McKinsey because you have these great partners that have deep expertise. But I'm sure they kind of always hesitate because if we make them too popular, then they can take the clients away. But it's interesting to think about what other companies right now are acting just as, like you said, supply chain, and basically their employees are hidden. But like, if you have like really good employees, maybe just, why don't you market them to clients? You said, we have this person you've never heard of, and they're like they're amazing at design. You should hire us because we have this person.
And vice versa, which is you should come work for us because look at the supply chain of work we're providing to you.
Exactly.
What does your job cost you?
Time.
Time, is it an opportunity cost?
So fair enough. I think, let me say, like, I love my job. And part of the reason I love it is because obviously intellectual freedom. I have lots of leeway. There's certain things I need to do at a specific time, and that's teaching, which I love. So, it's an opportunity cost. Like, would I be able to spend my time better? I'm not entirely sure because I do love the research. So it's a bit like, yeah, I love my work. I don't know if I would do anything necessarily differently. We have quite a bit of free agency as faculty. Again, it's also like it's good and bad because you need to define your own work. And it's like, if you like it, if you're creative, if you like the freedom, you know what to do with the freedom. Probably you don't think too much in terms of opportunity cost.
Is there administrative overhead?
Yes, of course. Yes, fair enough. That's the part that I'm sure some people love it, and I don't like that part.
I haven't asked this question before, which is odd. Would there be a switching cost if you were to move institutions?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to think about companies and employees generally. I would say if you think about universities and faculty, the switching costs are minimal compared to other companies, right? Because think about it, your research is, well, technically the IP is the universities, but it's like I would do the same research. It's right. Switching costs, it's the moving house and stuff like that, which has nothing to do with the employment. It's basically the geography or stuff like that. But like the employer-specific switching costs in terms of for faculty, for academia, I think they're pretty low compared to, say, something else. If you work let's say you work as an engineer at Toyota. I don't know why I keep picking up on Toyota, just the brand that comes. But you work as an engineer at Toyota and say, like, I want to switch companies. I think the switching costs are high. Why? Because there's a certain way of doing things. You're kind of embedded in the system. There's certain processes, and they're not going to be the same if you start working for General Motors. So the switching costs are much higher. For faculty, there are some norms, of course, that I think is pretty low.
Which makes you, in my opinion, more of a customer in the sense that we have to take care of you better because the switching cost is low. Okay, this has been fascinating, really fascinating. And I very much appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. I love it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, The opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.